Hello and welcome to the Elevate podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Nowakowski. I am a salon owner, educator, mindset, and leadership coach that helps salon owners go from overwhelmed and burnt out to motivated and empowered. It is my mission to help you systemize your business, generate more profit, and create a career that you are absolutely in love with. Join us every week to learn about the small shifts you can make to elevate your business regarding mindset, marketing, social media, business systems, and so much more. As we wrap up another year, I want to hear from you. Our 2023 listener survey is now live. Whether you've listened to one episode of the Elevate podcast or 90 episodes, I want to hear your feedback to create even better episodes for you next year. As a thank you for your time, participants can be entered to win a $100 Starbucks gift card and a 30-minute coaching session with me. Your time and feedback mean the world to me. To take the survey, visit the link in the show notes. Welcome to this week's episode of the Elevate podcast. I am so excited. We have my personal lawyer on today. His name is Dave Anders. Dave has been my lawyer pretty much for most of the duration of owning my business. We're going to be chatting about non-competes, what that looks like if you are a salon owner and you're trying to recruit a stylist, what that looks like for you as a stylist. We're going to talk about trade secrets, and we're just going to give you a little bit of insight on how it has an impact. Now, mind you, we are in the state of Illinois, so every single state is going to have a different law. We always recommend that you get advice from your lawyer or seek legal advice with any information from your business. I will also state that this is not legal advice. This is not a form of advertisement. This is just for the sharing of information with my listeners, and I hope today's episode is beneficial. Take a moment to introduce yourself and to kind of give a little backstory of who you are and what you do.
Hi, Patricia. Thank you for having me on the show. My name is Dave Anders. I'm an attorney with Hutchison, Anders & Hickey. We practice in Tinley Park. I've been practicing here for about 39 years now. We have a general practice and done all kinds of different kinds of law, including employer business law and various contract law, and really enjoy my job. And I'm happy to help you answer some questions today.
If you've been feeling overwhelmed and overworked from owning your salon, you're not alone. If you're like many salon owners, you wanted to build a salon that makes you feel fulfilled, passionate, and something that brings you freedom and flexibility into your life. But you ended up being exhausted from taking on all your business tasks alone. It doesn't have to be this way. It's time for change. The Elevated Salon Owner Collective will help you do just that. You'll automate your salon, implement solid business systems, transform your salon culture, and take charge of your online presence to regain freedom back into your business. I'd love for you to experience the freedom and fulfillment that you've desired when you decided to create your business. To learn more, visit opulentbeautypro.com/elevate or click the link in the show notes.
So obviously, one of the things that's important to know is that Illinois, as of January 1 of 22, passed a revised Illinois Freedom to Work Act, which defines covenants not to compete, defines covenant not to solicit, and there are restrictions in that act. So kind of the first analysis needs to be whether a covenant can even be entered into. There are earnings restrictions on covenants not to compete at $75,000. So if an employee does not exceed $75,000, any covenant not to compete is void and unenforceable. So that's kind of the first threshold. So depending on the earnings of the employee, and then a covenant not to solicit, the threshold earnings are $45,000. And those will be going up every 3 years by $5,000 increments until they reach, I think, about 90 in the one case and 60 in the other. So that's an important element of this, depending on what kinds of covenants or restrictions that an employer is seeking to do. They can't do them with an employee making or $75,000 or less. So that's important. Also, the other thing is if you are going to be able to do these covenants with an employee, there are certain restrictions. And over the years, case law had kind of evolved to define exactly what these restrictions were going to be and how each covenant not to compete was going to be analyzed. The big Illinois Supreme Court case was back from 2011, was reliable fire equipment versus Arredondo. And in that case, it would say it was enforceable only if it was reasonable in terms of duration, geographic scope, and the scope of activities restricted. What generally ended up happening is that each covenant was kind of judged and analyzed on its own. There wasn't like a cookie cutter approach because all of these reasonableness standards would be different depending on the industry, the employee, and other factors. So the law was kind of out there that way. It did later provide, a couple of years later, there was a case that mentioned and dealt with what consideration. So the consideration is part of any contract. And so in this case, the case law evolved to provide that just basically keeping somebody working was not sufficient consideration to have them sign a covenant not to compete or a covenant not to solicit. There had to be actual adequate consideration in addition to continued employment. And that was generally either a contract or an agreement to employ for 2 years or more, or a bonus, or some kind of a stipend, or an agreement to specifically train while they're employed to teach them to do more things. There had to be some additional consideration for the covenant to be enforceable. And now that's kind of the case law. And then we have the codification of it in the Freedom to Work Act. So I think that's kind of what everybody has to look at. So an employer will have to analyze their covenants if they're seeking to do that with an employee. They'll have to analyze them and make sure they comply with the case law and now this Freedom to Work Act. So an employer probably, if they're looking at an employee from another salon, I would suggest that the employer find out first whether that employee signed it. That's an important thing to find out in advance. Did they sign a covenant? And if so, you'll want to see it. You'll want to have your attorney review it to determine whether you think it's a strong covenant, whether it's complied with whatever the case law and the statute provides. And so that would be an important thing for a salon owner to do if they were looking at another employee to see if there is such a thing to do. Now, having said that, what employers, we have experienced that sometimes employers, depending on how badly they want somebody, they either can negotiate as part of that deal with the employee that if some kind of lawsuit is brought, that they'll defend it or they'll negotiate it and settle it for them or something. If there is such a covenant that's been signed, sometimes you can just negotiate that as part and parcel of the transfer of the employee from one salon to another, that you just settle it up and say, listen, rather than litigate, sometimes parties and or employers' salon will come in and just pay a little extra to get the person and not have to deal with the litigation.
So another thing that I think a lot of salons, they have a tendency to train people right out of school. So they're really kind of just going all in on their stylist to make sure that they have, the right technical, that they have all of the, things that they need to be successful inside of their salons. So what are some legal implications for something along the lines of like trade secrets? Situations from other salons that I've really researched, most of this is, public knowledge, you can look these things up online, is getting sued for stealing trade secrets.
That trade confidentiality agreements, trade secrets, invention assignment agreements, those are all exempt from the statute. So the point of the statute that I referenced, the Illinois Freedom to Work Act, that's dealing with covenants not to compete and covenants not to solicit, employees and clients and things. So specifically confidentiality agreements and agreements dealing with trade secrets, that's fair game. So that's a separate issue and the statute does not cover that. That is separately actionable and, largely prohibited. And there can be agreements that an employee will not violate any confidentiality of information, share customer lists, do trade secrets, things that they've learned that are very specific to the employer having taught them something. Those trade secrets and things are separate and are perfectly fair game to have in an agreement with an employee as you hire them, and then actionable if the employee violates.
Especially, I think in our industry too, it's like everyone thinks that they've come up with the next best thing. In reality, You can't really reinvent the wheel. So I think that is something that has to be taken into consideration too, because essentially, if you do get taken to court for these things, then you have to hire legal representation and then you have to prove that it's original or that you did not take original information, I'm assuming, correct?
Yes. So what will happen is the logistics of that is that the plaintiff would be the salon owner that says that I trained an employee, I I gave them certain training that was a trade secret that's proprietary to me. And this employee left me, took that with them and sent it over to another salon, right? So you sue perhaps the employee and you sue the salon owner, maybe, but certainly the employee. But it's really then up to the salon owner that claims to have provided this specialized proprietary information and trade secret type of tactics and things to the employee. It's up to that salon owner to prove that, in fact, what they trained and what they taught was a trade secret and is special to that salon owner. And that's going to be difficult. Like you say, in the salon field, I would suspect that there isn't a ton of just completely revolutionary, brand new, nobody's ever done before techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be a difficult road to hoe, to prove just exactly what that was. Now, soliciting customers, providing customer lists or business, how maybe you run your business or how you bill, those kinds of things that are confidential to you, maybe that kind of thing is more actionable. But the trade secret one would be difficult to prove, I think, in most cases.
Right.
But you're right that both sides would have to spend money. So the plaintiff salon owner would have to spend money to initiate the litigation and hire an attorney. And then the defendant would then likewise have to hire an attorney in all likelihood. And so I guess it just depends on exactly what the goals of the plaintiff are. Or is it to send a message? Sometimes the goals of employers are just to let people know that, hey, listen, don't mess around too much because I will take action. I take these things seriously. This is important to us as a business owner. So I'm going to send a message and let people know that if you do this, I'm going to take action because it's important to me. That's sometimes the goal. Sometimes there might actually be a trade secret or some violation that you have been damaged by, and you're intending to recover damages because now that trade secret is out there and somebody else is using it, and you're likely to have less revenue, less profit, et cetera, as a result. If you can prove those damages, then so be it. But that, again, I think is probably more the exception to the rules. It's a complicated, difficult bit of litigation.
So what constitutes as unfair competition and how can it be legally addressed and prevented? Because that's another thing that I was doing research on is unfair competition. Is that something that is something that people should
I don't really
know
know
about?
that unfair competition is a thing so much. One thing that is out there that there is case law on and is this tortious interference with contract. So if an employee is under contract with another salon and the recruiting salon knows of the contract, and then that recruiting salon intentionally tries to induce the third party, the employee, the stylist, to breach the contract and come over to them. In fact, that conduct by the recruiting salon causes the breach and the other party is actually damaged as a result of the breach. There is a cause of action called tortious interference with contract. That, again, is a difficult bit of litigation. And if it goes forward, it's expensive on both sides to pursue. As far as the unfair competition, I don't know factually, are the majority of salon stylists making over or under the $75,000 threshold? Because your ability and an employee's ability to go somewhere and work for somebody is definitely the trend in the law, both case law and statute, is to let them work, let them go where they would like to go. So certainly for an employee under $75,000 a year, I think the salon owner has got very limited liability if they're trying to recruit and get some good stylists to come work for them. I think that's a limited liability for that.
And with this new law that's coming into play, when is that going to become effective?
Oh, it was effective January 1 of 22.
Okay, so it's already in place
for almost 2 full years now, and it definitely limits and restricts covenants. So any covenant that has been drafted since then is going to have to comply with that statute. And if it doesn't comply with the statute, then it would be void and unenforceable, just straight up. It also kind of talks about if it is okay, if you are dealing with an employee earning over $75,000 and you have drafted things correctly and you have provided the additional consideration and it does meet all the reasonable tests, then it can be enforceable. The reasonableness tests are, the geographic location, how far, how long you're keeping somebody from working. Those are all going to just basically have to be addressed on a case by case basis most of the time.
So what is something that, because I feel like non-competes are really very common in our industry. What are some things that people should look for when they're signing a non-compete that could possibly be detrimental?
First of all, the non-compete is going to have to comply now with this new statute. And part of that does provide that the non-compete has to include a notice that the employee has 14 days and is advised to get counsel to look it over. So that's part of that statute.
So they need 14 days. Yeah, that's
so they need
perfect.
some time. And if you provide that, if the employee makes over 75,000, you still have to, under the reasonable test, that's what they have to look at. So a salon owner trying to use covenants would have to make sure that the covenant document is complying with the statute, and then tailor it and make sure that there is protecting a legitimate business interest, doesn't provide an undue hardship on the employee, it's not injurious to the public. Those are kind of these reasonableness standards that are in the statute that have to be complied with. So probably drafting covenants now, if somebody is using an old covenant, they probably need to be reviewed and revised in most cases.
Yeah, because what happens a lot of the time is these salon owners will give the person the contract same day and say, you have to sign this today before you go. And They don't allow them to have someone look it over. And then they try to utilize those contracts to really kind of instill fear so that they don't leave, which I think is just so toxic and wrong.
Yeah, and in most of those cases, that scenario is going to be unenforced. So that the employee is not going to really be at risk, and the recruiting salon owner is not going to be at risk, because there has to be. So even if the stylist is making over 75,000 and meets that threshold, they still haven't. In that case, they're not providing 14 days. They're not providing the advice to go to counsel. Just keeping a job is not in and of itself enough consideration. There has to be this additional consideration, and that consideration has to be, according to the case law, some agreement to keep the people working at least 2 years, right? Or some signing bonus. Listen, I'm going to hire you in additional consideration for you to sign this covenant not to compete. I'm going to pay you an extra $10,000 as a bonus or something. There has to be something. And I think in so many cases, most of these covenants are not going to comply with that. And I think you're right that a lot of times they're used just more of a fear factor, try to keep the troops in line, And I think that's very likely to be a lot of what the point of that is.
Okay, so quick question. You're saying there has to be some sort of exchange, so like a bonus or some sort of, advantage for the person who is signing, pretty much. When they're signing the contract, we're going to give you this $10,000 bonus. You're going to work for us for 2 years, and the contract kind of like coincides with that. Would training be considered, receiving any sort of training? Because I think, too, a lot of these non-competes are offered with salon training. So they get to go through their education. Would that be considered like a fair exchange?
Yes. So that is one of the things that I've seen in some cases, some places will have training before they hire you. You let you come in, and then at some point they train you after. But if you offer some training, special training after they've been hired, in addition to the hiring, that can definitely be appropriate consideration for the covenant not to compete.
Interesting. Okay. One last question, and this is going to be for the salon owners. As a salon owner, obviously they're doing what they believe is best to protect their business with these non-competes. I don't make my team sign a non-compete because I feel like if you have to force somebody to stay in your business, it's not going to be a great culture or a good relationship. Do you even think it's worthwhile to have stylists sign non-competes, or is it something that you feel is necessary to protect businesses?
I think it's probably an unnecessary act. I think in most cases, and again, I don't know how much a typical stylist earns, but if they're earning less than 75,000, they can't do it anyway. I mean, now under the statute, so that's out. So it's just going to be the stylists that are earning in excess of that,
right?
That are even fair game. And in that case, I think you're right. I think the covenant not to compete then has to be supported by additional consideration. And then what are you doing to do that? And then what is the employee expectations? And I just think that it's probably, other than a club or a fear factor, and again, and that's a business, each business runs their own way. In your case, you're indicating you'd prefer to just have a good culture where they want to stay, and that's what you're trying to do. I think that as a practice, in all likelihood, these covenants not to compete are not going to hold up very often and are not going to actually be enforced very often, and they are going to be just for the purpose you've pointed out. So I don't,
Perfect.
If it was me, I don't do them here at my office for whatever that's worth, but we've seen them. And I think that you're right that we've had instances and cases, and over the last few years, my partner and I have each had, where these came up, and they were both in context of hair salons. So people want to keep the good stylists, and then the good stylists want to make as much money as they can, and somebody else wants them. And trend in the law is to let that stylist kind of be fair game and go out and work and earn as much as they can. And so it's not easy to restrict that.
Perfect. Where can people find you, and how can they get in contact with you?
Oh, my office is in Tinley Park. Phone number is 708-532-7100. And my email is danders, DANDERS at HAH Law.
Perfect. Well, thanks for being on my podcast, and I appreciate it, of course.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. A lot of fun. I'm happy to do it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Elevate podcast. If you loved this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. The Elevate podcast is hosted by me, Patricia Nowakowski, and is produced by Opulent Beauty Pro. To receive my free business guides, visit opulentbeautypro.com/free or click the link in the show notes. You can find me on Instagram at Opulent Beauty Pro or at Patricia_Nowakowski_OBS. If you love this show, please consider subscribing, and we will see you next week.